Alan is a photographer and a writer. He's based in New York, and he's represented by Gitterman Gallery. He won in 2017, 2018, he won the Rome Prize from the American Academy, which I think is absolutely exciting. Must have been amazing to be there. Alan is a teacher, he's a professor at Pratt, and he also teaches at the School of Visual Arts and at the International Center of Photography, which is where we have met. I also teach at ICP, and that's how I know Alan. So Alan, I will hand this over to you now. If you can introduce Pablo or whatever you want to do, please go ahead and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Anya. And thanks everybody for joining us on this rainy day in New York. Not sure how it is everywhere else, but so good to see so many of you. Pablo and I met last summer when he was participating in the thesis show from his MFA program at Ithaca College, the Image plus Text program. Drew Sawyer, curator at the Brooklyn Museum, had put us in touch. Drew had made guest visits in that program. And for the first time, I saw Pablo's work and his book, Greenfield, which we're going to talk about. Even though Pablo had been teaching at International Center of Photography, as I had been, we hadn't had a chance to meet before that. Pablo is an image-based artist, publisher, and researcher living in Amsterdam. He has a BFA in painting and an MFA in studio art from University of Barcelona, a diploma in general studies of photography from the Institut d'Estudis Fotogràfics de Catalunya, Spain, and the MFA that I mentioned in image and text from Ithaca College. His artistic practice involves researching, collecting, and generating image-based materials and archives, addressing concepts such as time, change, representation, and countered narrative. His work takes various forms, from photographic installations to publications. He is the founder and publisher of Meteoro Editions in the Netherlands and the US. His work has been exhibited at Foto España in 2019, the Finnish Museum of Photography, Flowers Gallery, and many other venues. His publications are in the collections of the Guggenheim Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Centro de la Imagen in Mexico, the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and ICP in New York, Aramoto in Mexico also. And besides teaching at ICP, he's taught at Webster University in Leiden in the Netherlands. So today, Pablo and I are mainly going to talk about two of his projects, A Frame of Darkness and Greenfield. And so to begin, I know that when people come upon vernacular collections, sometimes they know where they're from, how they're sourced, and sometimes they're anonymous. But in my own experience and many people's experience that I've observed, it's overwhelming at first to get your hands on like on such extensive and rich collections of photography that pose so many questions and offer so much potential. And besides the overwhelmingness of it, there's also this poignance in receiving things that have been lost or abandoned, that feel like orphans or they feel bereft. And there's this kind of sadness. And between the two things, the overwhelming feeling of what am I going to do with this? What is my responsibility to it? And how sad it makes me feel about the passage of time, about experience being lost, unaccounted for. Pablo, could you talk about those feelings and maybe your first experiences with the vernacular and how you acted upon them and maybe turn them around so that you brought other things like a sense of elation or accomplishment into the picture?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the intro, Alan, and thank you, Anya, for this invitation. I think it's great that we come together after sharing teaching classes at ICP a few years ago. So I'm really happy to be here today sharing this conversation with Alan. Definitely what you're saying, Alan, it's true. When you encounter these materials, when I encounter the materials from Greenfield, I felt somehow overwhelmed because in the beginning, there was a clear distance between the materials, the origin of those materials, those negatives and photographs, and myself as a subject and my background and my experience. So I remember finding those negatives in New York in 2016. And actually, it wasn't myself. I always have to tell the story right, otherwise, it doesn't go to the twist that comes later. So who found these negatives in a flea market was my husband. So we were having a Sunday walk in Manhattan in Hell's Kitchen. So he came to me, it's like, oh, Pablo, I found these photographs. I was like, oh, I'm going to check the photographs. So suddenly I went to this vendor at the flea market, and I found a box. It was a wooden box. And my first guess was like, well, these are like just prints or postcards, because that's what's the type of material that I used to find in these flea markets. But then I opened the box and I found envelopes. It's like, well, this is taking me to a different place. So when I opened these envelopes, I was able to see in each envelope multiple black and white negatives. So I was really, really intrigued about the origin of those negatives, because each envelope had dates, locations. There was a lot of information to relay on, but at the same time, it was this distance from the beginning between myself as a subject and these found materials. So I asked the guy who was selling these negatives, like, hey, can you tell me more about it? Because I thought at some point that those negatives were belongings from his own family, and he was trying to get rid of them, or he had in some way a connection with them. But he told me like a quite intriguing story. He said that he bought a lot of the materials that he was selling that day, not only photographs and negatives. He was selling more trinkets. So he said that he bought them through an auction in a small town called Greenfield in Massachusetts. And he received information from that wooden box with the negatives. He was told that those negatives were found in the photographic store in that town in Greenfield. And when they ran out of business, basically they left a lot of materials behind inside the store. And one of them was that wooden box with the negatives. So he said to me, and that was, I guess, the key for me to start this project and kind of like decide to buy the negatives. He said to me, these are the forgotten negatives of the town. So that was very, I don't know, it was kind of like almost like a title or something that it was really screaming to me, like, you should do something with this. At least you need to get those negatives and see what happens. So I bought the box with the negatives. And the first thing that I decided to do was to basically place Greenfield in the map. So at that moment, I was living in New York, but I'm not American, and I had a few gaps on my American geography. So I just wanted to check where was Greenfield, and kind of like, to be honest, like a quick Wikipedia look and see where is Greenfield, who's living in Greenfield, like major things happening in that town. So to my surprise, I found out that there are more than 26 towns in the United States that are called Greenfield. So that kind of like disconnect me to all my preconceptions. Like I was thinking, well, I found these negatives, they belong to this town. So I looked through the light to the negatives. I found all of these pictures from families. So I started like kind of like creating all of these different narratives about the town, the people living there. But then when I found out that there are more than 26 towns called Greenfield, it's like, wait, maybe the important thing about this is not Greenfield, Massachusetts. It's more than Greenfield becomes a common stage for things that happen at certain periods of time in the history of America. So that's how I kind of like engage my research with these negatives.
Before we look at that project,
yeah,
and hear exactly how you dealt with it, which I do want to get to, I want to skip ahead and say, okay, so you began to make pieces for the wall based on that, but you also made a book. And it's very interesting to me that your concept about the epilogue of the book, can you talk about that? Because the epilogue led into the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, I mean, through this time, looking at these negatives from Greenfield and working on the publication, at the same time, I was also checking many archives, like public archives. I was visiting the ICP collections in New York, and I was trying to understand how archives work, or how the idea of building an archive, it's set on different foundations. And through that process, a lot of questions happen looking at my Greenfield negatives. But the main question was, at that moment, I was looking at these negatives and seeing a lot of middle-class white families in the United States, a lot of fathers and mothers and daughters and sons, sisters, so everyone was there. But my question was, what is my family in these pictures? And that was kind of like the question that remained in the back of my head for almost 2 years, working with the Greenfield images and negatives. And that question came because I'm gay, I'm married to a man, and we have 3 kids. So there was a lack of representation for my type of family throughout these negatives. So that was kind of like the idea that moved me to the next project. And that's something that I explained, as you were mentioning, Alan, in the epilogue of this book, because from the beginning, I thought, I have a connection with these materials. I'm the one who found the materials. I really need to write the introduction to this book. I'm going to tell the story, how I found the materials, and how I'm kind of like archiving or creating an archive, a fictional archive. But then I realized that my experience was so distant from the experience photographed in these negatives that for me, I had to, in some way, close a chapter with Greenfield that allowed me to open the next one, that it's a frame of darkness. And that's how I decided to compile all of my notes, kind of like journal notes and ideas about what it means to create a legacy with images, what it means to be a queer family, what it means to be erased from the history of photography. And all of those things and many others came together to this epilogue that it's, for me, the closing chapter of Greenfield the Archive and the opening of the new one, that it's a frame of darkness. I decided to create my own counter-narrative for this new project called A Frame of Darkness. So just going through all the images from Greenfield, but also, again, like visiting all archives, public archives, and also checking digital collections, New York Public Library, Cornell University, ICP collections. I was also working at that moment with images from the Peter J. Cohen collection in New York, that it's an amazing collection of vernacular photographs. I realized that there was this lack of representation, and that was kind of like my challenge for this new project, how I can work with these materials that I already have from Greenfield, but I'm also sourcing throughout other archives or still buying found photographs in flea markets, eBay, internet, and kind of like create something that I'm missing. The type of picture that I wanted to see, or the type of narrative that I didn't find in these official archives. So that's how I started building these pieces for A Frame of Darkness.
Can you just run through these one more time, because they're complex and rich, and I just want to show everybody digest them. And I also just wanted to ask you specific questions about them.
Okay, let me go back to the first one, and maybe we can start from there.
I mean, for one thing, the title, just going to the title, A Frame of Darkness. So that first question that I asked you about sadness, is that related to darkness in the way that you're referring to here?
Yeah, in some way it's related. I think, at least in my experience as a gay man growing up in a country where there is a strong influence of religion. I mean, I'm from Spain originally. My family is not extremely religious, but of course, I grew up going to a Catholic school. And I guess as many other people, I kind of like struggle finding models and finding different ways of expressing my sexual identity. And I think that it's translated, it's some sort of, I don't know, queer dark sadness. It's that idea that you want to be yourself, but you cannot, because most of the time we don't have those examples around us. And that idea of sadness is also related with the idea of darkness and the project, the title of the project. So for me, A Frame of Darkness is basically a negative. It's a piece of plastic with gelatin silver that it's showing me something that is not real, because it's showing me a portion of reality. So for me, that it's already fiction, but also that portion of reality, it's in darkness.
So also in these, there are these, well, there's the theme of water, which feels like a metaphor for the subjective emotional interiority of these figures. It's like what they're feeling. We're looking at them figuratively in a more objective way, but we're also looking at these images of water, which, you know, repeat in an interesting way, and, you know, for me, express this emotional energy.
Yeah, for me, definitely the water in this first chapter of A Frame of Darkness, it's key to understand something that you cannot see. The idea of, and that's something that it's again related to the idea of darkness and what is light, what it's dark, how there are like these binaries, these dualities. And the waterfall and the water running, for me, kind of like brings the metaphor of something that it's a running force, but we have this impossibility to see the whole waterfall. I mean, maybe we can see it with a drone and a helicopter, but every time you take a picture of a waterfall, because there is movement, there is always like a different impression of the waterfall. And that
the other thing that's striking to me about this is just, these are sharp juxtapositions between types of imagery. You know, there's like a familial, figurative, sort of snapshot-oriented image versus this, what you call landscape image. And it's interesting to me, these, if you keep scrolling, just to think about how maybe contrasting those types, those genres of images are. But I think in photography and fine art photography in the last 20 years, there's been this widespread shift in bodies of work or series of work to including images of different genres. Whereas previously in photography, it was more typical to see in a body of work or a series, a single genre, for instance, a portrait or still life or landscape, etc. And now photographers mix those things up again or more. And it's just, I feel like that's a sort of trend that's being reflected in the kind of collages that you're making also, of creating these sharp juxtapositions between genres.
To be honest, I never thought about that. While you're mentioning mixing these genres in photography, for me, it really operates the idea of looking at all of these collections, not only again the negatives from Greenfield, and kind of like finding ways of representing masculinity at certain moment in history and in a specific location. And I was really I was really struck by the idea that masculinity, it has a strong connection with nature at some point in the history of photography, and how there are all of these categories or subcategories of the man in nature, the explorer, discovering the idea of the water, the idea of the rock. So I was kind of like working with these categories that were already there in the history of vernacular photography and the idea of like representing masculinity, and trying to bring them to my idea of what masculinity and representation of queer individuals is. And that was
that idea about categorization is interesting to me too, because I would say that among artists who use the vernacular to construct things, they're either usually categorizing, collecting things and displaying them in categories or genres, or they're creating collages. So in a way, you're in between, you're doing both, right?
Yeah, for me, of course, my behind the scenes when I'm working in the studio, there is a strong process of categorizing and kind of like going back to these categories. But then I need to really create this physical intervention on the images and create a hybrid between this idea of the categories, but then in some sort creating a new category by mixing them together and collaging them. So I really need to do this physical intervention on every image to kind of like work with the idea of different planes and what you can see, what you cannot see, and playing the metaphor of the water to represent all of these male bodies in the images.
I think, whenever we talk about those categories of, when we talk about the binary, masculine, feminine, male, female, we have to remind ourselves that it's like such a more complex situation, right? Because within the male is the female and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And then in between all of that is like this fluid spectrum that creates any number of variations that are in, our social experience now becoming more and more possible to live and act out. How do you feel about addressing that expansion of what the idea of the male is or masculinity is? I feel like, gender fluid and trans people have really made us so aware of the possibilities of that fluidity and the, expansion of civil rights and, our consciousness as a society about trans experience and gender fluid experience has made us hopefully much more aware of how complex we are and whatever balance we choose to create between those two ideas or concepts of masculine and feminine.
Yeah, I agree with you. But something that it's happening to me when I'm looking at these pictures and sourcing material, it's even difficult to find like the little and subtle changes that I want to detect in a regular picture where there are two subjects that they identify as a male subjects, or they were identified as a male subjects. I was having a conversation recently with someone related to for a documentary and more like the idea of like documenting the truth. And that person was mentioning to me like, well, the work that you're doing basically are your projections on these images, because you cannot prove that these subjects that you are isolating or collaging, they were identified as a gay or queer subject. It's like, no, I cannot do that. And that's kind of like my challenge. I'm trying to build something that fills the gap for this lack of representation. So, but then the question went again to the idea of truth and fact. And we were all the time moving between fiction and representation. And it seemed to me at the end of the conversation that acknowledging the idea of fiction in photography and how fiction can create new representation, it wasn't enough for someone who was looking for the truth in the photograph. So saying that, if I relate to what you were mentioning, Alan, the idea of male or female identified bodies and everything in between, like non-fluid and binary and trans, I think I don't feel still there to talk about that, the representation of those bodies, because I'm still struggling to really identify myself in these materials and try to create the representation that I feel will dignify what I'm missing. I don't know if that makes sense, and it's an answer to your question.
Yeah, I guess like looking at an image of this, like this, I think, you know, that there was like a whole history of figurative representation that precluded the nakedness of men. And by that, I don't mean nudity, but I mean psychological exposure of the vulnerability of male figures. Whereas accompanying that was this huge history of male representations of the female nude. But because men had privilege, they were not exposed, which makes the image of them to us in this period a little bit more intriguing, because we're trying to get at what it means and what that is, that idea about masculinity and maleness. And generally, I think, you know, as you dig at it and pull away at the seams, it's going towards finding what the vulnerability is and how that's expressed, and just what exactly is the sensitivity and vulnerability of maleness. What is it? And you know, you are looking for images that suggest gay orientation in the male figures, or sort of codes that might reveal that. But I think even just looking at images of men in previous times is a part of that curiosity and intrigue, you know, especially by gay men, at like what gay men and trans men, you know, also women, I think, is like, what is that unexposed vulnerability that resides in this idea of maleness?
Yeah, something that I also was really surprised to see in terms of like the attitude or the posing in these images was that the idea of being in front of the camera makes you aware in some sort of way of who you are and how you want the camera to capture you. And I could see in most of the images where there was a male and a female, or a couple, male and female, there was, I don't know, I'm wondering if it's something that I see based on my experience and my kind of like social and sexual background, but I see a way of posing on the male figure that it's completely different when I look at pictures where there are different groups of only male. There is some sort of like a feeling of losing the pose. There is some sort of feeling of being safe in the group of males that for me also takes me to my idea of identity as a gay subject. So I don't know, it creates a different typology of image when you look at these groups of young males in nature, how they pose, how they touch their bodies. And I don't think most probably there was nothing explicit about the picture, but still there is a loose in the pose and the attitude that makes, for me, the reading of that type of image completely different from, I guess, the original purpose of the image.
I also wanted to just mention something that formally you're doing when you create installations with this work. Can you scroll down to the picture that shows the installation of the collage that uses photo stands?
This one, the first one.
Yeah, but there's another one in that PDF, I think, that actually shows how that image is made in an installation.
Let me go to the PDF.
Because what you're doing when you take it into installation is creating this 3D experience. And here it is. So there's a diagram of the installation which shows you how it's presented, and then we can see that these images are being held by photo stands, and that's a really interesting. I was talking about the juxtaposition of genres of images before, and here it's that juxtaposition, but also one between the poetic aspect of photography, of a photo image, and the mechanistic thing that comes with the medium of photography that we deal with all the time. And you could also look at that as objective subjective. But I love how that feeling is conveyed by the way you set this up, the angle that you chose, and I like that you also made an image from this that just is the 2D image, the one you showed us at first that was on the announcement for the talk. But I think I'm really interested in that exploration of the sculptural possibilities that can happen in the use of photography, because it's still a pretty untested area. I think of my favorite artist who worked on that edge between sculpture and photography was Marlo Pasquale, who died this year, and her work can be seen at the site of Casey Kaplan Gallery. But that show that's on that gallery, that work that she did specifically that I'm enamored of was 10 years ago, and I don't see that many people trying to bring these two areas together, and the way you're doing it is interesting because it's so self-reflexive vis-a-vis photography itself. the mechanics of it, its, you know, its forms of presentation, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this piece, I guess, comes to the beginning of my art making. When I was in college, and then after graduating with my BFA in painting, I had the need to kind of like switch to photography, because I was a painter, always painting from photographs, and I was the one producing those images. So at some point I decided, like, well, I have to switch and stay just with the photograph. And I started my connection with photography after doing this transition from painting to photography, went directly to installation. I was really curious about the mechanisms that you can activate, physical mechanisms with the image and the viewer. And I started experimenting with the idea of the installation as a physical experience between the image and the subject, and how we read images in relation to our body. That is not only something related to dimensions, of course, but it's also the experience of moving throughout the space and going back and forth between images, and how the space is adding a new layer of meaning to the photographs. So that was something that I did when I was in my first MFA many years ago, and kind of like stopped working on that sense of the installation and the connection between the body and of the viewer and the photograph. But in this case, after working on these double dimension, bidimensional pieces with the collages, I was feeling that I had to go back to the idea of the space and see how these images will be experienced throughout the space. So in this case, with this installation, there is like, now you can see on the left side, this small drawing for the different pictures, how they were placed. If you were looking from the outside, you could see only excerpts or like small crops from the image in the center and the ones around, because all the images are facing the insides of this circle. So you really need to get inside the circle to experience all of these waterfalls around you and this double portrait of a subject. Waterfalls are always the same picture. And for me, repetition works with the idea of the circle and the loop. And that's why I decided to work with the same image. But then the portrait in the center comes from two different 4x5 negatives of the same subject, a studio portrait, where the photographer decided to make like a small switch on the lighting and the pose with the subject. So the difference is so small between portraits that creates this movement in circles around the waterfalls and the subject, trying to understand what's happening, if you see a change or not, because you can clearly see that the waterfalls are the same picture. And it's this idea of like moving in circles, how the water is surrounding you, and how for me this works in some way as a metaphor of a safe space for this subject. This subject is again surrounded by waterfalls, and these waterfalls are also related to the other pieces on the wall.
Can you now go back to Greenfield and show us how you, back to that initial question that I asked about how you deal with the overwhelmingness of a collection that you suddenly come upon? I mean, my first experience of that was going into my grandmother's living room in the 70s, and she was on the verge of throwing away all of her negatives, and she had photographed extensively, and at a certain period, her children basically documenting all of my mother's clothes that she made for her, and my mother, you know, posing in them, and all of their friends and siblings, and, you know, all of that. And she, instead, fortunately, I came in, and then she thought, well, would you like to have these? And of course I took them, but then like it took me years. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out how to use them. I've used them in different ways. So you got this whole archive of, you know, what was left in a photo store in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and put it together in a book in a very unconventional and interesting way that involves different, you know, techniques of like cataloging, but also reflecting your mental process as you responded to them and adjusted to them. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, I'm just showing now. Maybe we can run through the video while I'm talking of the publication and kind of like understand more the process. So I remember at the beginning I had this need to dignify the subjects in these pictures, but also I had the need to dignify the photographer or photographers behind. I was all the time thinking, what will happen to me if my negatives are lost? And I was thinking about the idea of legacy, and I was thinking as a gay person, what it means legacy to our community and visibility. So all of those questions were in my head, and I had pretty clear that I had to keep something that it was related to the original structure of these images. And that structure came throughout the envelopes. They were perfectly coded when I found them. And I'm going to scroll to the envelopes. That's the index of this publication. So all of these envelopes were perfectly coded. They were following alphanumerical codes. So I was able to basically organize them following the original codes. And for me, that was enough to create a structure for the publication and also create a connection between the original envelopes and negatives with my purpose for this publication, that it was more like the reflection and the text.
And the texts that you just showed us were all your invitation to a large number of writers to submit something which you, in case by case, you never were sure whether it was true or fictive, and you just kind of accepted all of that as their creative contributions.
Yes, that was the plan when I invited many colleagues, friends, and people that I really admire their work in relation to archives and vernacular photography. So I built a website where I digitize the entire archive of Greenfield. And I send the websites with these invitations for, I think we're in the original setup, 22 people invited. At the end, I had 18 pieces of text published on the book.
Why did you use their initials instead of their names in this part of it?
Well, that wasn't a strategy of kind of like following the idea of the archive itself. I never knew about the photographer or photographers who produced these images. So I wanted to create this enigmatic approach to the text in the way that you don't relate the content to the subject who produced the content. But at the end of this first chapter, the notes on the archive, there is an index of content where you can access to the name of each writer, and you can link their piece of writing in the book.
I love something, there's something that you wrote about the book cover itself, and this kind of dark, but something with a silvery sheen, like photographs. And I love the way in the other books that you publish, you are very attentive to texture in the materials of the book itself, of that resonate with the images.
Yeah, I think for me, a book is experience itself. And that's, for example, one of the reasons why I haven't shown these projects in a physical space. I mean, Greenfield only exists as a publication, and the tactility of the publication and the experience that you have going through the pages is key for me to really share the content and the message. So what you were mentioning about the cover, I had pretty clear in mind that this idea of darkness that was resonating to me with the negatives had to be reproduced in some way in this publication. So the first approach that we had with the designer, it was very radical. So, and I was very convinced, but at some point I thought that it was going to be so close and hermetic that people could not access. But the first idea was to basically create a publication like the one that you're seeing now, and that publication will have all the images in negative as a raw material that I found. At the end, we decided to basically work with the opposite and go with the positive image so people could access to the content of the pictures. But then for the cover, we wanted to keep the idea of having a piece of silver gelatin. So that's how we decided with the designer and also working with the printer to kind of like create this very subtle, almost like no ink print. But at the same time, when you move the cover and you have light reflecting, you get the same feeling that you get when you're looking at one negative, silver gelatin negative.
And that just reflects your dedication and your mission of publishing to graphic design as well as photography. You're really interested in working with innovative designers, and you choose different ones for different publications, right?
Yeah, every project that I'm doing in Meteor Editions involves a new group of people collaborating. So I'm always trying to find the right designer for the publication. We also commission texts to writers, for scholars, for image makers. So we always try to find also the connection, and we try. I think for me, one of the goals with the books and the texts in every book at Meteor Editions is to create a bridge between communities. So usually I'm trying to, if I have an artist from Europe, I'm trying to pair that artist with someone who's in a different location, most probably will be the United States. And that's a way of making also the project to travel. In this case, for Greenfield the Archive, I was gravitating between my experience at that moment in the US. So I invited quite a few people from the US, but also I invited people from Europe, from Spain. And because this project was co-published with a museum in Spain. So I wanted to bring these two different experiences to vernacular photography and archives to the publication. So yeah, answering to your question, Alan, every book has a new team. All the artists that I'm following that I admire, and I always feel like, oh, damn, I wanted to make that project. I wanted to make that research. That's what it's motivating me to make a book with them. I want to have all of this group of image makers and artists around me that in some way nurture my own practice too. And I believe working together, making a publication will nurture also their own practice.
So I think we should start with the Q&A. And the question is, are the Greenfield photographs for you a stand-in for the photographs of any town, USA? In other words, are the Greenfield images a quintessential pool of images to describe America, gender relations, the prevailing nuclear family, repressed iterations of sexuality, etc.? And is that how they serve you in this work? I ask because I'm interested in this responsibility we put on images of this kind.
Yeah, for me, the images from Greenfield, they operate in some way, as they were mentioned in the question. And they operate because throughout my research, I came across a few key events in the United States in the decades where these images were roughly produced. And I say roughly because I was only able to date based on the information that I found on the envelopes. And the first images from Greenfield that are dated are from the late 30s, and the last images are from late 60s. So that gave me some sort of like time frame to do more research on the American society and understand the content of those pictures based on things that were happening. So definitely there are multiple things connected. So first of all, all the families depicted in these images are white families, middle class. There are no representation of African American, Asian American, or Latino families. At that moment, after the Second World War, it's the beginning of, and I'm going to go like pretty quick. I'm not going to mention all the information precisely, but after Second World War, all the veterans are coming back to the US, and there is a need for cheap housing. And that's the beginning in some way of the suburbs outside of the cities. And at that point, it's when mostly white families are moving outside of the cities and living in the suburbs. Really, something that really struck me, and it was shocking to me, what is considered the first suburb, it's called Levittown in Long Island. And when it was created, there is an amendment in the creation of Levittown that says that only families with Caucasian race could move and live to that suburb. So that goes directly to the content on these images. When I see all of these families that they don't live in the cities, it feels more like a suburban life throughout the pictures. And then another thing that it was really striking for me was the connection of image making and Kodak. It's almost the golden age of Kodak between the 40s and the 70s. And Kodak is selling the biggest amount of cameras, especially Brownie cameras that are created for families to take snapshots and document their family life. It was really surprising for me to go over the manuals of the Brownie cameras. And even though these pictures are not made with Brownie, most of them, because they're made with bigger cameras, like large format or medium formats, I could see that the photographer or photographers producing these pictures from the Greenfield archive, they were aware of the fashion that Kodak was producing at that moment, how to take good photographs. It's a sentence that is repeated over and over in these manuals. And also all the steps that you have to follow to take a portrait of your wife, to take a picture of your barbecue, to take a picture of your dogs and kids. And something that is also interesting in these manuals, not all of them, but I encounter a few of them that they use the pronouns in a way where they define clearly that the photographer has to be a man and the model has to be always a woman or kids. And when you go through the illustrations, it's really difficult to see a man posing in front of the camera. There is always the wife, the woman with the kids, the pets, the animals. So that also, I don't know, says a lot about the content of these images. And that's in some way my research background for Greenfield, the archive.
Thank you. That question about Greenfield was from Fabian in Vienna. Let's open the questions. I mean, you can just unmute yourselves and speak up if you have a question.
Anybody has questions, please.
Anya, maybe you have one if someone doesn't have one.
I would love to hear more about the next book, what your design ideas, layout ideas are for the next book. That would be interesting to me to hear about a little bit.
So for the first book, next book, it's kind of like interesting how when Alan was mentioning that he was able to see this show last summer in New York, at that moment we created like a small sampler with the program, and that's something that I can show you, and already follows the title, A Frame of Darkness. But in this case, this publication was made with a Mexican publisher with very specific guidelines. And this is just a compilation of one of the pieces from the work. After this, to be honest, I've been very cautious about the idea of publication with this project. For now, I'm kind of like very stuck in the idea of working only with pieces, going to the wall or more installation. I think that at some point I will start thinking about the publication, but I'm not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Somebody's asking what the reason behind the small size pictures on each page of Greenfield is.
We wanted to create a publication that look or follow some sort of like archival aesthetics. And the idea was to create these pages that look like a contact sheet. Something that we try with the designer in a mock-up was to reproduce every negative at 1:1 ratio size. The problem was that the publication was exceeding, I think, the 250 pages. And it was like really, really difficult in terms of the economics working with this museum in Spain to go with this like not super sized publication, but really long extended publication. So, but yeah, we consider multiple options for the size of these images.
How, as an artist, like until which point we can get as an artist to intervene an orphan image? Like, because I don't know, like sometimes I think like even if they are orphan, we maybe tend to have this sense of respect of the image of that because it belongs to someone. Mm-hmm. So until which point we can go as photographers or artists to not be like extract, like give like to become like really like crazy doing stuff that maybe could not damage but completely give another sense to the image that maybe it could be a little bit irrespectful for that. I don't know if
I understand what you say. I think for me that was a big barrier to kind of like break that respect to the images. And I respect a lot the images and the work that these photographers produce. But also I decided to work with these negatives and the other images that I'm using as a source material. I don't know the story behind. I'm just projecting my story and building a new story. Maybe if someone who's portrayed in these pictures can feel that I'm doing something that is very unrespectful to create this new narrative that is not related to the original purpose of the image. But at the same time, these images were orphans, so they're found images. So yeah. I think images deserve to have multiple lives. And those lives will come with every subject that look at them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I kind of like feel in that way, my practice.
No, yes, I noticed, like I really like, and also I love the images, like this project is amazing, but I was wondering if there is some kind of ethics or something maybe that we as a photographers must have, or I don't know, to have when we are working on that.
Something that I encounter in terms of like ethics. I remember my time in New York doing research at the ICP collections and working with one of the curators. And at some point, I was trying to find images that were categorized with certain topics as like man, male body, masculinity. But then I think the first day they asked me, do you want to see pictures from, I think it was one of the great photographers that ICP holds their legacy. It's like, no, I mean, this picture already has a big umbrella on top of it. And I don't want to change any story that it's already written. I don't want to change that legacy that it's around that picture, because there is already a narrative. But when I'm finding a picture that, again, it's an orphan image, I feel obliged to kind of like create this new narration and kind of like filter through my experience to give this second or third life to the image.
I understand also kind of, Daniela, you're talking about the ethics of what we do with the remains of, you know, a culture or people, or especially one that's underrepresented or disempowered. Like, what is our responsibility to when we find remains? And of course, photographs can be that. I can give you an example from my own experiences, that I found this amazing collection of pictures of Black American servicemen from World War II. And one of them was the photographer, and it was pictures of his friends, their girlfriends, but it was, you know, mostly, not entirely, other Black soldiers. And because, you know, it wasn't just one or two pictures, it was a collection, I, you know, found it very valuable, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. And I, you know, my first impulse was to use it myself, and then I didn't actually feel that was right. And I offered it to a Black artist who used his own family work and his body of work, his family photographs. And he wasn't interested in having it. And I kept it for all these years. And then until year before last at Pratt, I had a graduate student who was retrieving pictures of Black gay men to use in her work. And I suddenly, you know, I still had those pictures, and I just thought, wow, here's another person that I could offer them to who maybe would figure out how to use them. And that's what I did. I gave them to her. And that was one of those things which was just like an ethical consideration, for sure.
That's a great story, Alan. Thanks for sharing that. I find that really important. I'm also looking at the time. There's one more question in here that I would like to read out, and then we can do another one. Did you ever see or guess if the photographers or photographer are present in any of the images?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And I have a guess of who's the photographer from Greenfield, or at least one of them. To be honest, I spent so much time working and digitizing and looking at these pictures that until I finished the publication, I wasn't able to build all the connections. But definitely there are a few families that they cross members and relations in this archive. And you can see who's married to whom. And you can also see that if they go to a honeymoon and the couple is on the honeymoon and only one of them is on the picture, at least I know who's the photographer at that point. So there is definitely a guess for at least 2 photographers at the Greenfield archive, but I didn't do much research about the photographer itself. I think Greenfield has so many and multiple approaches that even for me, every time I'm opening the book and like reading one piece of text or like looking at the pictures, like, oh, I always find something different, something new to connect to my experience at that moment, or maybe to connect to the whole project itself. So yeah, I mean, that's something that I always invite people. If you can check the book, or if you have a copy, spend time, because it's not a book also with the pieces of text. It's not a book to read at once. Just take your time, read one piece of text, go throughout the images and see the connections and kind of like create your own story of Greenfield.
How do you look at your own family snapshots that you're taking now of your family? Do you look at them as material, or just the way we all do as snapshots and you don't know what's going to happen to them?
I don't know what's going to happen with them, but I have to say that I'm in some sort of, I'm creating my photo album. So I'm very aware now, working with a lot of photo albums and archives. I'm kind of like aware, and I think I'm kind of like creating an aesthetic to the album. I'm only using instant pictures to my family album, my husband and my kids. And I'm kind of like archiving them in a certain way. I don't know if that will be a chapter of A Frame of Darkness in the future or not, or someone will find them in a flea market. But there is an intention behind. So I don't know what intention is taking me to. Let's see.
All right. So, any other questions? We can do one more. Otherwise, now is your chance. And then I think we'll wrap it up. Alan, do you want to?
No, I think that's good. Thank you so much, Pablo. Thank you for the generosity of all your answers and your work and the way that you are so also generous towards other photographers working in this way. And Anya, you as well. Thank you for hosting this and making these great conversations happen.
Thanks so much for being here, and a big thank you to everybody who was here and donated and come back in the fall. And it was very nice seeing all of you.